From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, along with Jeff Wickman. Ahead today from the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock is featured on this week's Cattle Market segment. She'll comment on the just-released USDA beef export data and on the ongoing influence of uncertain corn production on the cattle trade. Then, from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State, Gregg Hanzlicek will talk about an unusually high number of cattle pinkeye cases being reported for this time of the year. He'll look at why that's happening and the treatment options available to you cattle producers. Later, Jeff has this week's 4-H segment. K-State's Anissa Jepsen discusses the Military Partnership Program, providing resources to military family youth. Right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're glad to have you along for this Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. We'll take up several items on the beef cattle market scene now, as we're visiting with the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center in Denver, which again is a project co-sponsored by K-State and numerous other land-grant universities. Along with us again is Katelyn McCullock. Katelyn, we've quite a cross-section of things we'll take up today, but let's just briefly recap this past week's fed and feeder cattle trading. On the fed side, it was, on the cash end of it anyway, another week of lower prices.
Yeah, fed cattle markets traded mostly lower heading into Friday, trimming off about $2 a hundredweight from last week's prices in the 5 area. Feeder cattle followed a similar pattern, and they were mostly lower, even though volumes for auctions were up nationally by quite a bit. I think a lot of this is playing into the corn market and what folks are seeing or not yet knowing what corn acres are going to do and where that yield's going to end up. And that's pushing prices higher across the board, and I think adding to some of the weakness here in the feeder cattle market.
Since you're bringing up these issues with the corn crop, they have been influencing the cattle market, obviously. How long will that influence last, one has to wonder?
Well, the acreage number is still shaking out. It's a little bit of a moving target. So every Monday afternoon, we're provided a USDA NASS crop progress report, which provides a general view of what's happening. But until we get that June acreage report, that's going to be the first time we actually receive farmer-based survey data on what acreage is and how those plantings are since the prospective plantings released in March. Now, when we're looking at corn acres, it's anything but set in stone right now. We're looking at lower acres than prospective plantings, and we've revised our forecast down quite a bit. And that's going to move forecast lower for 500 and 600 pound calves, as well as 700 and 800 pound yearlings for the rest of the year, likely. Now, that's pricing in right now at a corn price of somewhere around $4.50 a bushel. But I will caution you, I think that could move higher in the next couple of weeks, depending on what the next couple of Mondays show as crop progress and how the weather holds out.
So we could see still more pressure from this angle anyway on fed cattle prices and the feeder market for that matter. This could extend well into the deeper part of summer, it would seem.
I would agree with that. So we've dropped price forecasts through the rest of the year between $4 and $7 a hundredweight for 500 to 600 pound animals, and through actually the third quarter of 2020, but less of a reduction there in the fourth quarter of 2020. I think the impact here is going to be pretty widespread. Even though we're expecting corn to rebound in the following year, it's still, these short crops tend to have long tails. Mm-hmm. On the yearling side, we lowered prices by about $2 to $5 a hundredweight in that same time frame based on that higher corn price right now. But we didn't change much to the beef production numbers, so the supply side is largely looking about the same. That's primarily a feed cost-driven adjustment.
Well, is the story sunnier on the beef demand side. If we look at the domestic market, as you consider boxed beef trends currently, is the market getting that normal boost from the summer grilling season yet?
Well, this week we saw the choice cutout slip a little bit. It's been slipping the last couple of weeks. This week's average cutout price was down 83 cents a hundredweight from the prior week and sitting about 2% below last year's. Currently, this has primarily been driven by year-over-year declines in the choice rib primal, which is still historically high, but sitting at about 6% below last year. If you think back to last year, those values were very high. So that's about $3.61 per hundredweight. Most of the other primal values are up. The strongest compared to a year ago this week has been the brisket value, which is about 18% over the same week in 2018. When I think of grilling season, I like to think of, what are trimmings doing as well, and beef and pork trimmings remain positive. The fresh 90s and 50s are pricing higher than a year ago. Last week, boneless beef prices for the fresh 90% lean was up 0.6%, and the fresh 50s are up about 8.6%. Pork trimmings are up 43% when compared to a year ago. But when you think about all these elements factoring into the supply chain of burgers, hot dogs, and sausages, I see that as a positive sign, specifically for grilling, where some of those steaks look like they're showing a little bit of weakness here. But again, that's all compared to a year ago, which was relatively strong. Now, I will say cooler weather usually does not help with grilling season. It's been a rather slow warm-up across the country, and nicer weather will certainly help heat things up in terms of beef demand for this summer.
That's on the domestic side. We've new numbers as well, you tell us, on export demand for U.S. beef.
So USDA ERS released the carcass weight-based trade data earlier this morning, and that's for the month of April. Now, beef exports fell in April 4% below a year ago. Canada, Hong Kong, Japan, and Mexico all saw year-over-year declines, and Canada was among the largest, down 22%, along with Hong Kong down 41%. South Korea, Vietnam, and China all showed very strong growth year over year. That's a really positive sign. Those are some of our more fringe markets, although South Korea is now the second largest market for beef this year. Year-to-date beef purchases are only 48 million tons behind Japan, which is our largest beef market. South Korea alone increased 20% in April over a year ago, which is really impressive when you think about 2018 annually was up 35%. So we're showing a lot of strong demand from South Korea, Vietnam, China. Vietnam is up 40% over the year before, and that's on top of an annual gain of last year of 23%.
So thank goodness for good news on the beef demand front, both domestically and abroad, Katelyn. Otherwise, these markets might be in a real world of hurt, it would seem.
We still have a lot of production on the market, and so I take it as a good sign, even though maybe the percentage changes don't tell the full story when you're comparing against 2018, which was a very strong year for beef. But I think we're still in relatively good shape from a balancing of supply and demand perspective. But both the domestic side as well as the trade side are certainly helping out work through those larger supply numbers.
Want to finish with one last thing here, Katelyn, and our pasture and forage conditions are in pretty good to, if not excellent, shape across much of the region. And that would then imply that we would have ample hay supplies going into the fall and winter. Would that not be of a benefit to our producers in the form of lower hay prices?
Well, I hate to put a damper on all this positivity, but I think it really depends on where you are regionally and how much moisture you really have. Mm-hmm. Now, it is a positive that grass potential for pasture and range is going to translate into higher forage production. That means positive things for holding cows longer, especially in this higher corn market that we're seeing. But in terms of hay, that hasn't necessarily translated into the hay market, and part of that is because of the wetness and the ability to put up good quality hay. Mm-hmm. Now, in some areas of the country, we're seeing significant delays in the ability to put up that dry hay. First cutting has been delayed in the Midwest and as well as the Northern Plains. When we talk about new acres of alfalfa that were supposed to come online this year, over half the new acres were in those two regions, and those will likely will struggle early on and hopefully recover. And so we're talking about how much production do we get out of those fields early on here. Now, the impacts are going to be somewhat regionalized, but if you think about the national picture, hay stocks are very tight. We're probably looking at higher prices early this season as those first cuttings and tight stocks still really control where those early season prices are. Now, if we miss a cutting entirely in some of these regions, that's going to have a huge impact well into summer when you talk about hay availability and what type of prices you might see. Now, of course, if you have plenty of forage in your pastures, maybe you're not as worried about it, but in some areas, a lot of folks might need to restock their barns, and a normal yield may not be enough to gain excess hay stocks in one single year. The other thing I would say is that there's a quality component to this as well. Even if folks were able to put up hay earlier than now, some of it has been less than ideal quality. Now, this is particularly important for dairies having quality issues. There may be a lot more cow hay available, but that's going to really hit those dairy farmers hard. As alfalfa prices jumped $15 a ton nationally in April over March prices. And so we're looking at that as well. It's still very early. I think hay yields can definitely rebound, and that we can make up for it based on where all the forage potential seems like it's the groundwork is there. And so there's still ample time to make up some of that production numbers. However, I think with the tight stocks, the way that they are, even with a good year, we're still looking at probably high prices, higher than a year ago prices early on, and probably not much dissipation in those high prices as we move forward, just because those stocks are so tight. But again, this is going to be regional, and I wouldn't expect a significant decline in hay prices probably until late this growing season, if not next year.
Very useful input, and we appreciate your time, Katelyn, as always. We'll catch up with you again in a few weeks, and many thanks.
Thank you.
Katelyn McCullock with us, the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, with those thoughts for you cattle producers on the markets and associated factors. By the way, be sure to check out the center's website. It is regularly refreshed with good information for you producers at lmic.info. Again, that's lmic.info. Agriculture Today returns after this. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
For you now on this Agriculture Today, another visit with the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine. Gregg Hanzlicek is along our way regularly to talk current topics in bovine health management. Gregg, you say you and your colleagues at the lab are being inundated with reports now about eye problems in cow-calf herds beyond the norm. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is something we talk about on this program every year, but we usually talk about it in the late summer or early fall because that's when we see the issues. But we've had multiple cases already this spring in animals that have just gone to pasture.
What we're referring to is, in fact, the condition that all cattle producers are familiar with, and that is pink eye, right?
Absolutely, where the animals start with the watery eye, and then they hold their eyelids shut because the sunlight is painful, and then some of those animals develop the ulcer on the cornea and in the center of the eye. It's the typical classical kind of pink eye scenario is what it is. And
it can be unsightly, moreover costly in performance of that animal. Before we get into the recommended response to pink eye, what's exactly going on here to cause this acceleration in pink eye cases out there, Gregg, do you think?
Well, we're not sure, but one of the things we do know that the organisms that are associated with pink eye are on the eye. They may not all be there at the same time, but they're normally there. And so in order for us to have a pink eye outbreak, it requires something to break the integrity of the cornea. And what we think is going on right now, just driving around the state of Kansas, is there's a lot of pastures that are really tall, headed out, and we've got animals that are grazing that. So we're thinking that tall grass with the seeds are lacerating the eye and then letting those bacteria start an infection. And the other thing we've noticed in the last couple of weeks are the number of flies. The flies this year have just started coming out. They're tremendously high populations. And face flies are the fly that's associated with it. What they do is their little mouth part when they're feeding is a raspy kind of thing, and if there's enough of them, that'll actually lacerate the cornea also. So we think it's both or a combination of both of those things that are initiating these infections.
You say that there could be multiple kinds of organisms that would lead to this condition.
There are. There's 4 bacteria and 1 virus, and unfortunately some of the bacteria have names that are very, very similar, but the number one organism that we isolate from eyes is called Moraxella bovis. It's been around a long time. There's vaccines for it. But the different thing about this year is that there's multiple herds where the only organism we found, and it's a relatively newly found organism, it's called Mycoplasma bovaculi. That's the thing that's making us scratch our heads a little bit, is that seems to be the predominant organism in a lot of these herds.
That organism isn't normally, or hasn't in the past normally been associated with pink eye then?
It hasn't. It's always been Moraxella bovaculi. This is Mycoplasma, so it's a totally different organism. And there's been research in the past to try to figure out whether these organisms actually had anything to do with pink eye. And for most of the research out there, they've had trouble causing pink eye by using this organism. But we've gone in multiple herds and sampled eyes in the course of an active infection outbreak, and it's the only organism we find. So we're beginning to think that maybe this organism is becoming a player in our pink eye cases.
Sounds like something that the laboratory will be investigating further then.
Absolutely. We're looking at it pretty hard right now.
Well, the first sign of pink eye setting in, the lesion will develop, but it starts with the watering of the eye. That's what producers will notice first.
Usually there'll be just excess tearing, and it'll run down the face. And then if a lot of these animals will just clear the infection on their own, but if they don't, then eventually they're going to have an ulcer. And an ulcer, just think of it as a crater in the eye, and then sometimes those animals will become blind because they don't recover, or they'll actually lose the entire eye. So it can go through multiple stages of the disease.
But any way you slice it, it will bother them to the point of their performance being subpar.
Absolutely. It'll decrease weaning weights. It'll decrease mama cows eating, so their milk production won't be as good as it is. There's been some estimates out there that say that about $150 million loss to the United States beef cattle industry every year because of pink eye.
Wow. Well, let's begin with prevention as far as responses go. The insecticidal ear tags, are they a decent defense against pink eye?
They are a decent defense. They're not perfect, but absolutely recommend that for fly control that producers use fly tags. With these many flies this year, probably 2 fly tags in the adults, and then some herds will probably have to start putting fly tags in their calves also. But that's a good place to start. We could talk about this at some other time, but rotating those insecticide ear tags and all that's important too. But starting with the fly tag would be a good way to go. Would
it pay to complement those tags with an additional topical treatment of some sort to help fight off pink eye?
Absolutely, and I don't know this for sure, but I find it hard to believe with the number of flies that I've seen on animals, even with the insecticide ear tags, that it's going to take more things like some pour-ons or some back rubbers or some of those other things in addition to the ear tags in order to control the flies this year.
As far as treatment goes, there are antibiotics out there. Give us the rundown on their use and effectiveness, Greg.
There are antibiotics out there, and for the Moraxella organisms that we typically deal with, there's some that are labeled for treatment for that organism, and they're very effective. Mycoplasmas are a totally different organism. Basically, the producer needs to go through their veterinary to decide what antibiotic's appropriate, but not all antibiotics have an effect against mycoplasmas because they don't have a cell wall, and there's some other things that are unique to that class of organism.
So you need to consult with your veterinarian to know what to choose before you go with an antibiotic treatment.
Absolutely. And back to the cases where we were seeing this mycoplasma, what we're seeing is that these are herds that have been appropriately treated for pink eye, but they're not seeing the response they normally do. And then we go in there and we'll take eye swabs, and we find the only organism that's there is this Mycoplasma bovoculi.
So once again, that conversation with your veterinarian is essential here. There are vaccines back on the preventative side, once again, to help protect against pink eye. But there again, one needs to be proactive in that well in advance.
Absolutely. And there are multiple vaccines out there. To my knowledge, none of them contain all of the organisms that we're talking about for pink eye. So some might be effective in some herds and some not in others. One of the things that producers and veterinarians are doing now is actually culture out the organism that's on the animal's eyes and then having a special, or we call it an autogenous vaccine made for that herd. Just like you said, that's not going to help this year because you're not going to get the vaccine in time. That's something you might want to do this year in preparation for next year, hoping you still have the same organism in there next year.
But you need a customized vaccine in some cases.
You absolutely do. Not all cases, and some producers or veterinarians will say, let's try a commercial product, and then if that doesn't work, maybe we ought to go to one of these autogenous. For us, we think the first step is to actually take eye swabs and determine what the predominant organism is first, because if it's Mycoplasma bovoculi, you're probably going to be very limited on your vaccines.
You must enlist the help of your practitioner at that point. One thing that you did want to pass along, if producers are inclined to look at a mineral treatment for pink eye control, got to be a little cautious about that, you say.
Absolutely. Now, the trace minerals are important because some of those are very important for eye health, and I know producers know this, but I think it's worth mentioning that we can't be feeding a mineral that contains an antibiotic to control pink eye. There are no products on the market that are labeled for that, and I think all the producers know that with the VFD rules, for feed-grade antibiotics, there is no extra label use. So because there are no products out there that say it's labeled for pink eye, we can't be putting it out there to control pink eye.
So that may be a change in one's protocol that they need to be on top of.
Absolutely. And we're talking about a federal law here, so I don't think we need to be monkeying around or trying to skirt the laws as they are in the books. Whether we agree with it or not, right. I think it's something we have to live with.
Well, Greg, in that pink eye cases have expressed themselves unusually early this year, the concern is that this may be a problem that lingers for another couple of months. Is that the case?
Absolutely. This could continue all the way through the late summer and early fall when we typically see it. So instead of being a 2 or 3 week thing, we may be talking about a 2 or 3 month issue for herds. So that's one thing we're recommending producers is we're out there checking pastures and making sure our mineral boxes are full and everything. Take a close look at those eyes also and try to, if you just have a few, that's when you start calling your veterinarian and say, let's try to do something to nip it in the bud today instead of letting it go through the whole herd.
Have a game plan. Even if you haven't seen pink eye in your herds yet, be once more ahead of the game here by lining out your preventative measures. Greg, always a pleasure. Thanks for bringing this to our attention right here.
My pleasure.
He's Gregg Hanzlicek over from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University. Once again, that laboratory is receiving an inordinate number of inquiries from producers about this pink eye outbreak in many cow-calf herds around Kansas. Greg with some thoughts on the ways to go about responding to that situation on this part of Agriculture Today. We'll take this break now and then be back with more on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. In today's agricultural news, weather conditions this season could mean more disease problems for many crops. Gary Crawford reports.
A Kansas State University plant pathologist says if you are one of the lucky producers who have been able to plant corn or beans,
I hope that producers have been using good broad-spectrum seed treatments this year.
They may need them. Dr. Marty Draper, Interim Associate Dean for Research at Kansas State University, says soybeans planted in these cool, wet conditions will be more susceptible to diseases like
seedling, and stem rot diseases, like Phytophthora stem rot. That's one of the diseases that I'm looking at this year that I think could be a bigger issue. In the upper Midwest, I suspect Phytophthora is going to be a concern for soybean producers.
And for corn,
we're looking at seedling blights being the biggest problem early season. Later, we could be seeing some leaf diseases showing up on corn, depending upon what their disease resistance package is.
And you can't rule out sudden death syndrome. For wheat, Dr. Draper says farmers may need to consider more scouting of fields this year for head blight, expected to be especially bad this year. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Increased safeguards and increased commodity prices are among the impacts on our nation's pork industry due to concerns about and impacts globally of African swine fever. Rod Bain has more.
For over 3 decades, representatives of the global pork industry have gathered every June to Des Moines, Iowa, to take part in the World Pork Expo, the world's largest pork industry-specific trade show. But not this June, as the announcement came earlier in the spring that the 2019 World Pork Expo was canceled.
Our producers were very supportive of the decision. We received a lot of input and had experts from outside the organization evaluate the risk.
That risk, according to Jim Monroe of the National Pork Producers Council, is African swine fever. This fatal threat to the U.S. pork herd is not in our nation, and Monroe and fellow pork producers are doing everything they can to keep it that way.
We think it was very low, but not zero. So the livelihoods of our producers, their families, the health of the U.S. swine herd, those are our number one priorities. So we are very comfortable with the decision.
The pork industry is also working with the Department of Agriculture in preventative measures to keep African swine fever out of the U.S. Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs Gregg Hanzlicek says in building upon existing safeguards such as beagle patrol dogs at points of entry and expanded testing for rapid detection and response,
we're having discussions all the time with the producer industry as well as the processing industry to make sure that we're listening to their concerns, we're reacting to those concerns, and they're helping to guide us so that we can continue to have the utmost in protection out there.
Jim Monroe says one nation impacted greatly by ASF is China, both from the pork production and consumption side.
There's an enormous opportunity with China production being significantly down due to African swine fever. It's the world's largest pork-consuming nation. Pork is a staple of the Chinese diet.
Indicated by recent increases in hog prices for this year and next in USDA's May meat outlooks, fueled by speculation over African swine fever impacts in and to China's swine herd. Agriculture Department Chief Economist Rob Johansson noted a $9 month-over-month increase in hog prices in May.
2019 hog prices at $54.67, and then we expect it to continue to rise to $60.25 per hundredweight. That's up an additional $6 in 2020.
Yet Jim Monroe says the ongoing trade tensions between the U.S. and China are making it difficult for our country's pork producers to capitalize export-wise in the Chinese marketplace.
Unfortunately, we're facing retaliatory tariffs in China right now that bring them up to 62% on U.S. pork. That's 50% punitive tariffs on top of already existing 12% tariffs. So we're at a pretty non-competitive position when it comes to China.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In other agricultural news, Kansas State University plant disease and horticulture experts are urging Kansans to be on the lookout for a disease that threatens oak trees and other susceptible plants and has now been reported to be in the state. On Friday, the Kansas Department of Agriculture announced that the pathogen that causes sudden oak death was found in rhododendron container plants. The plants are part of a shipment distributed to Walmart stores in Kansas and one Home Depot store in Pittsburgh from a supplier in Oklahoma. Sudden oak death is not new to the U.S., but this is the first time it's been reported in Kansas. Kansas oak forests are primarily located in the eastern third of the state. Red oaks are the only subgroup that is affected by this pathogen. However, Cheryl Boyer, a nursery crop production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, says it can also infect a broad range of nursery plants. Ryan Armbruster, the health and conservation forester with the Kansas Forest Service, says that most native oaks like bur oak are of the potentially less susceptible white oak group, but there are millions of red, black, pin, blackjack, shingle, and other oaks that could be impacted should the disease gain a foothold in the state. And in this week's Tree Tales, Ryan discusses cedar apple rust.
In late spring, especially after a recent rainstorm, the careful observer may notice alien-like orange, gelatinous objects attached to the branches of their eastern red cedar trees. This is not the fruit of a mutant cedar or jello from Mars, but the spore-producing body of one life stage of the cedar apple rust fungus. This fungus spends half of its life cycle on red cedars, waiting for moisture to prompt the release of spores. These spores find a home on apples, crab apples, or hawthorns, which leads to the second stage of this rust disease. When the spores land on a susceptible leaf or fruit, spots of orange-brown rust appear. This can lead to early defoliation, stressing the tree, and sometimes also damages the fruit. While removal of all cedar trees within spore-producing distance can theoretically disrupt the life cycle of this fungus and eliminate the damage to apples and hawthorns, this is an impossible task in most cases. The fungal spores can travel several miles, and cutting down every red cedar within that radius is simply not feasible or even advisable. A better plan, should significant repeated damage occur to the apples, crab apples, or hawthorns, is to begin spraying a fungicide in the spring when the orange fruiting bodies are producing spores on the red cedars. Keep in mind that a product labeled for use on an ornamental crab apple may not be labeled for use on an edible fruit-bearing apple tree. And what about those red cedars? If the fruiting bodies of cedar apple rust are an eyesore, they can be pruned out. But for the most part, treatment is not needed and not effective on red cedars. The best bet is to avoid planting red cedars in close association with apples, and vice versa. When selecting cultivars to plant, choose those that are resistant to rust. A helpful publication called Flowering Crab Apples from Dr. Jason Griffin, director of the K-State John C. Pear Horticulture Center, is available, listing many varieties of crabapple that show resistance to rust. Choose wisely, and you'll reduce the chance that you'll need to spray to control this disease. I'm Ryan Armbruster, Forest Health and Conservation Forester with the Kansas Forest Service, and this has been another Tree Tale.
And that's a look at today's agricultural news. Agriculture Today is back after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The 4-H Military Partnership Project at Kansas State University is part of a national effort to develop and deliver research-based programming and resources to military audiences and military youth. Kansas 4-H Extension Specialist Anissa Jepsen, who oversees that project area, looks at some of the activities and events taking place at Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth Army installations and at McConnell Air Force Base. Anissa, you have been doing a lot of training with Fort Riley, McConnell, and Fort Leavenworth. Let's start by talking about some of the things going on at Fort Riley. One of those was Train the Trainer.
Yes, we're really excited to have a great partnership with Geary County Extension Office and Fort Riley staff to provide training to frontline staff in experiential learning process. We also have been able to do some STEM programming, diversity and inclusion. It's just been a really great opportunity to share what makes 4-H so great.
How does the training work? I'm sure you have a comprehensive program, but maybe in a nutshell, how does it work?
So we're really lucky to be part of the Military Work Group, which is a partnership between all of the armed forces and 4-H nationally. So there is curriculum that's been developed that's specifically for the different kind of learning styles and program delivery that military uses. And so we do use some of that, and then we just revert back to the good old Kansas 4-H system. Our agents on the ground are really good at knowing what the communities need, and we develop programming that is based on that curriculum. It's a really fun way to talk to staff, to figure out what they need, and then develop curriculum programming that meets their needs.
How many clubs are there on Fort Riley? Is it a mixture of clubs, or is it just one giant club?
So that's one of the things that we've really been working on, because at a military base, it's really hard to have that traditional club setting. While we do have some clubs on Fort Riley and as well as in McConnell, most of it is done in like an after-school setting. So that's been a really great opportunity to talk to staff, for them to understand that it doesn't have to always be in that traditional club setting, that we can do 4-H in any kind of setting. Like I said, mostly after school, the kids get at least 6 hours of training and program development. So it's just been a really fun experience.
And one of the things that they've done is a mini fair, and you taught people how to be judges for this.
Yeah, so in partnership again with Geary County, Ginger has been great helping us develop some different opportunities. Fort Riley has always come to the Geary County Fair, but they have been in the open class. And so we wanted to make sure that youth kind of understood what conference judging was, that they had an opportunity to talk to judges. So we were able to train a handful of staff to be 4-H judges. And then we had around 30 youth bring projects to our mini fair. Staff were the judges. They had the guidelines to be a judge that Ginger uses in Geary County. So it was very similar to what she uses. And then the youth were able to get ribbons and then showcase at our April month of the military child.
So were they able to pick what they wanted to do in their project areas, or did you try and focus in on just a couple of things?
So this year, since it was kind of a pilot program, we did focus a lot on visual arts, and then we had some STEM programming. So the youth didn't get to maybe develop their project areas as much as hopefully next year, but it was just great to be able to share with youth and with the families that 4-H isn't about livestock all the time. It's a very important part of it, but we want to make sure that they understand that 4-H is for everyone, especially the military youth.
In terms of McConnell, you're doing some work with diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so we were really lucky to have one of our state specialists, Alaya, come and do some diversity inclusion training with McConnell staff. McConnell has really good staff that are really excited to do that 4-H programming, and so we were able to use some curriculum that was developed here at K-State and deliver that program to the staff.
And at Fort Leavenworth, what kind of things are you working on there?
So again, I couldn't do the things that I need to do for this grant without the help of local agents and staff. So we actually have local people on the ground that are doing 4-H programming with the homeschool co-op in Fort Leavenworth. It's a little bit different than what we're doing in Riley and McConnell because it's actually leading some project area work. But still, we're getting that out there and letting military families know that they're important to us and that they can experience 4-H.
What's ahead? What's maybe your next step in this process?
So I feel like our next step really is to get those geographically dispersed military families to be able to participate in 4-H if they're not already. So it's important to work with our communities around the state to host events that are not just for military youth, but that military youth know that they're welcome at. We have a large number of National Guard, Air Force Guard that we want to make sure that we're providing programming for those families as well.
And this is important because of the fact that they are a mobile population. They go from state to state,
right,
country to country, and this maybe does give them a way to have a connection once they arrive.
Yeah, and that is the hope of the National Military Work Group, which I'm a part of, is developing a more cohesive 4-H program across the world so that when those youth PCS or have a permanent change of station, that they can go from state to state or country to country and still have the same kind of 4-H experience. Of course, it's going to be a little different depending on where they're stationed, but we want to make sure that there are some things that are really creating that continuity that youth need when they're in that kind of environment, that transient environment.
And another thing that I think is nice here is this connection between the extension agents in those areas and the military personnel. That gives both an opportunity to connect with one another and make these programs even better.
Yeah, that has been the best part about this, is to see the agents in Sedgwick and Leavenworth and Geary really want to reach these military youth in a way that's not traditionally how we've done 4-H. And so I think that's what's so exciting, is that we're able to develop these programs or these train the trainers, and they do look a little different. But for our military youth, we need to have a little more flexibility so that they can get those experiences, just like youth that are participating in the community club model.
How are the youth reacting? I know that you've been doing this for not a long time, but what kind of changes are you seeing?
So we're seeing more kids be more excited about being a part of 4-H. You know, we talk to staff and make them kind of aware that there doesn't have to be a business meeting at every time that the kids get together, that they can work on project areas, and it doesn't have to be only in club time. And so once the kids see the end result of their project work, like we had in Fort Riley with the showcasing event, they realize that they're doing this for a reason. We talk about setting goals. We talk about how sometimes we don't meet goals and how goals are important in everything we do. And I think that that's one of the best parts of this program, is watching the staff talk about how the youth are really responding to them in this new way to really address 4-H programming on the military bases.
That's Kansas 4-H Extension Specialist Anissa Jepsen. To learn more about opportunities through the 4-H military program, contact your local extension office or visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.